Nerds, I am here with Brittany Ramos DeBarros. She is running for U.S. Congress. We're going to find out why, what she wants to do. But before we do that, we got to warm it up.
Hooked up with Drew Yang Gang, that's who I hooked up with Drew Yang Gang, that's who I hooked up. Yo, there's no place to hide now that he's arrived. I'm saying he ain't playing now with this campaign. Bang, dang, this and Drew, come roll with the Yang Gang.
Hello, nerds.
Hello, nerds.
welcome, Brittany. How you doing?
Thank you. I'm good. I'm so excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
It's great. It's always fun to start an interview after that trailer.
I know. I'm all hyped now, ready to go.
I know. Well, look, I know you're running for Congress. I know. I think I discovered you because I saw your profile on ofthepeople.us, which was great. But tell us a little bit about who you are and why you decided to run.
Sure. Well, I know that this is like a cliche thing for people running for office to say now, but I genuinely had no designs on running for office. I'm an organizer. But I live in this purple swing district here in Staten. It's New York 11, which is Staten Island and South Brooklyn. It's a battleground district. But I feel like we're really misunderstood, especially in the, greater New York City area. There's a lot of stigma and, Staten Island tends to be the butt of the joke here. When I'm a person, I grew up in a conservative military family, as a Republican, actually.
Mm-hmm.
And I think my parents instilled in me this real love for the values and ideas that America is supposed to be about. But I'm also biracial, and looking around, even as a kid, I could see with my own eyes that the America that my white family was living in was different than the America that my Black and Puerto Rican family was living in. And, my parents also promoted this beautiful narrative that so many of us hear about pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps. And if anyone works hard enough, they can make it. But I watched my parents and families all around us work incredibly hard, work multiple jobs, start businesses, do all of these things. And we were still always struggling to keep our housing and make ends meet for, church friends bringing us groceries. And so I had to look around and say, something doesn't add up. And I ended up going to school on a military scholarship. I graduated from University of Miami with a business degree. I commissioned as an Army officer, and I already had deployment orders to Afghanistan. And when I deployed, I still really believed that I was going to help the Afghan people, that I was going to fight for democracy and freedom and all of these things. But what I saw on the ground was devastating, frankly. It was so obvious that corporations were running the show. There was real toxicity in command climates and corruption. And it was really obvious that we were doing a lot more harm to the Afghan people than good. And so I came home hurt and confused. I struggled to get on my feet like a lot of vets, I think. And I think I still had this unfulfilled hunger to serve and to be of service. So I got my first nonprofit job working on economic and racial justice issues in major cities across the country. And I learned so much about the ways that our government and economic system are, often keeping people trapped in poverty and in struggle by design. Fast forward, I ended up speaking out about the wars while still in uniform. I joined an organization and became the national co-director of About Face, Veterans Against the War. We're all post 9/11 military veterans that do anti-war advocacy and use our voices in support of social justice issues. Became an organizer with the Poor People's Campaign as well, because I really appreciated the narrative of the campaign, which was a revival of Dr. King's narrative about the interlocking evils of poverty, racism, and militarism, and how important it is to be speaking about those things in relationship to each other. So, at the end of the day, folks in my district who know me from organizing work and working on these issues came to me and asked me to run. And I laughed at them. I was like, I curse like a sailor. I say what's on my mind at all times. Like, none of these make for a great political candidate. I'll help you find a better person. And folks were like, no, I think people in the district want someone real, want someone who understands, what it's like to come from, a completely different set of political beliefs and learn and grow and change your mind and really empathize and bring people together. And so that's the kind of campaign that we're building. And it's really exciting, the momentum we've already had since we launched in February.
Well, that's a really exciting story and journey you've been on. And of course, thank you for your service in Afghanistan. I know, whether people agree with that war or not, the people that served there were following orders and trying to do their best and going in with the best intentions. What is your take on the current withdrawal? I know on Twitter and in sort of like political discourse, there's for sure a lot of energy from people saying that President Biden has, really screwed this up, and that everything was going fine until he got elected. I don't believe that, but what's your take?
Well, I think neither of those things are
No.
like the full story, right? So I think that everything was not fine before he was elected, obviously. And it's I think a shame the way that the full picture of what's been going on has really been buried in media and for a lot of the public. Even when I deployed in 2012, my orders were to be a part of transition operations in preparation for withdrawal back then, because the Biden administration had run on the promise that we would leave Afghanistan by 2014 no matter what.
Yeah.
And even then it was so obvious that there were a lot of folks who were working really hard to make sure that we left as well as possible, as thoughtfully and effectively as possible, and did as well by the Afghan people as we could. But there were also a lot of people who didn't seem genuinely committed to that mission. And I think that we have to acknowledge that that's a culture and a climate that is cultivated, that is kind of dehumanizing to Afghan people. I mean, even now it's devastating looking at the bombings that just happened at Kabul airport. I can't even put into words how devastating the loss of those 13 service members is, who were there trying to help with evacuation operations. And also it's infuriating that most of the headlines don't even acknowledge that 60 Afghan civilians were killed in that bombing as well. And to completely erase that is to erase any value, to act as if their lives have no value or are less, or, are worth so much less. And that's something that I think has been a dynamic in the discussion and the discourse about Afghanistan for a really long time, despite the fact that these wars, were sold to us as for the benefit of Afghan people in a lot of ways. And so, what I think about the withdrawal is that the Biden administration was right to withdraw. I think that this was it was a meaningful thing to do for Joe Biden to put so much political capital and commitment into carrying this out. There's a reason that it's gone through 4 administrations without, anyone having the political courage and will to do it, despite the fact that the wars have been unpopular for a very long time with the public, is that it was always going to be violent and messy. You can ask any kind of troop off the street, like, what do you think is going to happen when we leave? And they would have told you that most people considered it inevitable that the Taliban would sweep back through as soon as we left, whenever that was. And so I think that it's important to highlight that I think that this decision had to happen. We had to leave. More time was never going to be helpful. But what I am critical of the Biden administration for, and I think we all should be if we're having integrity in the way that we assess the situation, is that I cannot make sense of why the Biden administration months and months and months ago did not make real efforts towards putting an infrastructure in place to evacuate the thousands and thousands of U.S. citizens, of Afghan civilians who supported U.S. and NATO operations for the last decades, as well as their family members. I think that that's morally abhorrent. And I think that it was avoidable. I think that watching Biden make claims like Afghans didn't want to leave the day after we watched people so desperate to leave that they were falling off of airplanes to their death is just, you know, I'm kind of offended that people would lie to our faces like we're that stupid in that way. And I think that, you know, as a person who's been on the ground and has also been in conversation and working with organizations, working with refugees, working on our refugee programs, there have been systemic refusals to really process, lift the caps, and, you know, prioritize the lives of Afghans who were always going to be put in grave danger once we left like this. And I think that that criticism is earned. And I think now the priority has to be saving as many lives as possible. And I think that means continuing, you know, withdrawal evacuation operations beyond the deadline of the 31st, if that's what it takes, because, you know, we're talking about thousands and thousands and thousands of human lives here.
Yeah, it's interesting. The original deal signed by President Trump with the Taliban was we were supposed to be out of there by May. So we're a little behind schedule. I'm curious, do you think there's ever a way where we withdraw and there aren't going to be yet another crowd of people like at the airport gates? Like, it just seems like it's just, you could do that for years and there will still be people desperately trying to get out of there. And at what point do you say, you know, we're moving on, like we're not here to be a permanent kind of asylum, you know, bridge from a very troubled civil war to here?
Well, that is a really, you know, apologist argument that is pretty ahistorical in that it ignores that the United States for decades beyond and prior our 2000, you know, to our 2001, 2002 invasion, has treated Afghanistan as a place for us to engage in proxy warfare with other nations, particularly during the Cold War in the USSR. That we have, you know, I think that to engage in a forum of foreign policy that says we get to meddle for decades, perpetuate the destabilization of a region through you know, the funding, training, you know, equipping of forces that are directly connected to those that are oppressing and harming people now. And then when we're tired of it, we get to just throw up our hands and leave because it's no longer convenient or popular for us, is not a foreign policy that is rooted in, I think, a concern or care for humanity. And it's also one that perpetuates an increased risk for our national security. And so I think that if the moral obligation of at least evacuating people who saved the lives of American troops for years and their family members is not one that speaks to you, then I think that the national security one is another one to consider, which is that, you know, most of us in other contexts agree that when you invest in cycles of violence, those cycles of violence beget cycles of violence, that there is a real cyclical nature to the forms of systemic violence that we're up against here. And I think to abandon Afghanistan with no real commitment to humanitarian aid or reparations for the harm that we've done Afghan people is to leave an environment where you know, we will continue to see escalating and growing threats to the United States, both in the region and here at our homeland. And so I think that, you know, the only way that we can interrupt the violence that we have invested in for over 20 years is to really invest in life, really invest in the kind of civil infrastructure that we know addresses insurgency and extremism. Our own defense manuals kind of articulate that vision, and yet we have never adhered to that. And so I think that it's time that we not just, kind of stop our investment in war, which is hurting everyone and not benefiting anyone, but that we really invest in a new framework of foreign policy that is about, addressing the roots of the violence that we will see continue to flourish without that.
Well, Brittany, we could talk about Afghanistan for a long time. I want to make sure we cover some other topics. So thank you so much for sharing, a really strong perspective and very principled view on that. Tell me a little bit about what do you think is most important to New York's 11th district? Like what's on their minds? What are their top concerns?
Yeah. Well, before I was just speaking about the importance of investing in systems for
Hmm.
life and that are, humanity affirming. And I think that that's what Staten Islanders, however they politically identify, are really hungry for. We are a quintessential working class, borough and district as a whole. We have the highest union density in an already union town of New York City. And, I think that we have a lot of folks who have felt left down by leadership for a really long time. We have had a new representative almost every 2 years for over a decade, Republicans and Democrats alike. We are often thought of as a very Republican borough. And yet, when you look at the registrations, what you see is that registered Democrats and progressives outnumber registered Republicans almost 2-1. In the district, and yet Democrat turnout is very low, whereas Republican turnout is much more consistent. And so in our campaign, we are really challenging an assumption that I think has not been challenged appropriately, that folks have held for a long time, which is that when you run as a Democrat, you have to run as Republican light. You have to run kind of to the right in order to win here. And yet what I think that has caused is this kind of self-fulfilling cycle where Democrats are so focused on flipping someone else's base that we have failed to really energize and engage our own base, despite the fact that by the numbers, it's the majority, before we even count the almost 200,000 potential voters who are not engaged as well, and are not registered with the party at all. And so I think when we've seen these amazing upsets or progress around the country in places like Georgia, Texas, Missouri, Michigan, where folks have turned that kind of traditional wisdom on its head and really focused on those voters who have not been engaged. And that's what we're doing. And we think people here are hungry for people who are going to be an unapologetic champion for working people, for working class people, and everyday families. And when you knock on the doors, that's what you hear. You don't hear people say, oh, this person is too conservative or too progressive. You hear people say, I can't even tell the difference. Why bother show up? And that guy sounds nice, but someone like that can never win here. And so there's this cynicism and hopelessness that we're looking to challenge by, advocating for things that are popular in the district, like investment in education, addressing environmental justice issues, which really plague our district in particular, as a district that is, we have folks on our South Shore who are still recovering from the effects of Sandy almost 8 years later. And there's been almost no real infrastructure investment or resiliency planning to make sure that we're ready for the next storm. And when you survey folks from across the political spectrum, believe it or not, that's one of the first things they say when you ask, do you feel that we're prepared for the next climate disaster? People almost unanimously say absolutely not, and express their fears and concerns about that. We have housing that is making people sick that hasn't been invested in and updated, let alone, the realities of the, people being priced out of the city. And, so those are some of the issues we talk about. We have the highest COVID case rate in the city and not a single public hospital. In Staten Island, we have real, healthcare deserts and food deserts, which we know also contribute to, negative healthcare effects. And so, I believe it or not, a lot of folks are surprised to hear that things like Medicare for all are popular in the district. And a lot of these policies that are popular with the general public are also popular in this district because people want investment in our communities. And so that's what we're fighting for.
Well, Brittany, we're going to talk about what the sort of top 3 things you would do if you got to Congress would be, or what you would be fighting for specifically, and how your constituents in the district would see some change. Before we do that, I do want to give a quick thank you to the people who make this channel possible. So let me just quickly give a shout out to our members. So at the highest level, we have Soldier One, who is our senior VP level. Thank you, Soldier One. And then we have our VPs, which are Kristen Slevin, Laura Lane, Patrick Dunn, Richard Johnson, and Bike. And then at the hardcore level, we have Mike, Gene, David, DK, Phoenix, Jack Lego, Kirsch, Mr. History, Byron, Mona, Susan Yang, Tony, Robert, Dean, Statner, Galessa, Jay Perrin, AA, Jay Bryan, Vivian, Dana, Flavio, Jason, Yoda, and Parth. And then at the entry level, we have V, Helen, Lisa, Sugar, Albert, Brandon, Brian, Peter, Arez, Your Maman, Sophia, Jedwiga, Mike, Doris, Emerald, Lori, Ben, Roger, Lisa, Christina, Vaughn, Rasta, Jessica, Elizabeth, James, Emma, Hui, Ira, Shoni, Philip, Jameson, Doctor, William, Karen, Monica, Mai, Ardent, Semery, David, Brittany, Sasha, Wana, Warren, Reddy, Lucky, and Kevin. Woo! So a lot of people supporting the channel. You know, it's interesting. Chats about policy with congressional candidates is not exactly like sizzling social media content, but I'm glad
I can imagine.
I'm glad that there are some nerds out there. They're like, yeah, I want to hear what Brittany has to say. And so tell me a little bit about how you think you could get things done if you got to Congress, especially because that district did vote for Trump in the last election. And as you mentioned, you're a Democrat and doesn't sound like you're going to run as Republican light. Do you think this next cycle is a time when it can actually flip? I mean, it's a competitive district, so it's not crazy. Yeah,
it is a battleground and we are ready for battle. But I think that it can. And the reason is because, like I said, I think that folks misunderstand what's going on here. While the district did go significantly for Trump, what folks need to understand is that Bernie is also wildly popular in the district. And the reason for that, in fact, this was the only county in New York City area where Bernie won the primary in 2016. And, just to give one example, kind of, or data point supporting that point. But I think that when you look at that and you talk to people, you start to realize that the district is more anti-establishment than it is conservative. And the reason that both Trump and Bernie speak to people here is because we've seen Democrats lead us. We've seen Democrats fail us, and we've seen Republicans do the same. And so, the most popular sentiment here is, excuse my language, but fuck the political establishment. And, but for real, it's gritty and people are just like, those people are these elites who don't care about us. And they have a lot of arguments to support those points. And so I think that people are hungry, for an approach that isn't really about partisanship, isn't about being, framing these issues that are really human issues as left versus right or red versus blue. For us and for me, these issues are about top versus bottom. It is about the corporations and the ultra wealthy at the top impacting our political system versus the rest of us, who many of us, even when we're doing well, are one medical disaster away from bankruptcy. And so I think that, for us, a couple of the things that I would prioritize and the way that we talk about this campaign is it's not about quick hot takes or quick fixes. There are real systemic and structural issues with the way that our government is operating right now that have to be addressed. That's not going to happen in 2 years. We're going to fight for policies that are low-hanging fruit to pass, that are going to better people's lives. But what we're prioritizing too is a long game that is about democracy reform. We've seen the John Lewis Act just come through, but we need far more. We have to pass HR 1. We need significant, expansion and protection of voting rights and other forms of democracy reform. We need serious overhaul to campaign finance. one of the things that I would prioritize is banning the naked corruption that is currently allowed with, for example, defense contractors who receive more than 50%, often up to 90% of their revenue from tax dollars via defense contracts, and then turn around and put millions of dollars back in the pockets of those same politicians who award those contracts, which is just like naked corruption. That shouldn't be legal. I think that, that kind of, that's one example of a campaign finance reform that we're not talking about enough. But I think we have to get that, money out of politics and put some of that power back in the hands of working people. And I think that those are things that open up the field of what's possible in terms of passing things like, public health care through something like Medicare for all, protecting our environment and having a real, green jobs and environment just transition through a Green New Deal, as well as, other investments in our infrastructure and our education that have positive and lasting effects. And so those are all priorities, but I think we have to address how power flows and how decisions are made in order to move a lot of those things forward. And we're honest with people at the door about that.
What are your thoughts about Ilhan Omar has been promoting the Support Act, which is kind of like the first step towards a guaranteed kind of minimum income? Do you think New York's 11th is ready to talk about stuff like that? And do you favor it, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's something I definitely, I support a universal basic income. Ultimately, I think raising any things that raise the floor, right? So whether that is through a UBI or whether that's through legislation that raises the floor by salary instead of rate, I think that that's good, because we need to be raising the floor. A system that relies on corporations and employers who, by the nature of the market, their interest is in shareholders and profit, right? Like, to leave the decision about workers and pay to them, we have to be practical that those interests are just, the incentives are not aligned. And so we have to create a reality that acknowledges that, and not pretend like the market is magically going to work in the interests of people and the needs of people with the way that we're currently structured. So yes, generally those are the kinds of approaches that I prefer, or not that I prefer, but that I support. I mean, at this point, it's wild to me that it seems like it's a fight just to say that everybody deserves a union and at least $15, right? The fact that people are still the fact that people are still seeming to struggle with that, it raises questions for me about how do we talk about this. And I think we've seen other candidates, in past cycles and in this cycle, continue to explore ways that we can, break this down so that folks see this as something that is not, anti-business, or, and that there are, this is a way of bringing incentives into alignment, right, for business and for families at the same time. So those are the things that I think we work on in a district like this but ultimately, yes, like whether it's wages, whether it's rights, whether it's, other protections, I think it's important for us to be thinking at healthcare, especially, it's important for us to be thinking about how do we raise the floor.
Well, that's great. I didn't know that you were supportive of basic income. I just added that as a tag for your Of the People profile. So now you'll be listed on our UBI candidates list, which I'll also put in the chat. Brittany, I know we're running short on time. What do you like? Tell me, maybe last question is, how's the campaign going? And for those people who are listening to this conversation and saying, hey, I kind of I like this candidate. She could be going places. How can they be helpful?
Yeah, thank you so much for asking. The campaign is going really well. Right now, we are the only kind of established campaign working to unseat my Republican opponent, which is Nicole Maliotakis. She is a Trumpist who voted against certifying the election results, voted against COVID relief, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Basically anything that can help everyday people. And we have raised over $250,000 in grassroots contributions. We are not taking corporate PAC money. And we have early endorsements from folks like Brand New Congress, Move On, Way to Lead, Gloria Steinem. We're Hulk endorsed by Mark Ruffalo. So we're feeling really strong, and we are already out there knocking doors. For us, this is not a social media campaign. We are out in the field knocking doors every week, because we know that it's about reaching people who have been left out of the way that politics runs here. If you would like to get involved, our website is Brittany, BRITTANY, just like it's spelled on the screen, for the people, or forcongress.org. Either of those works. There you can donate. We're on ActBlue, and you can also sign up to volunteer. There's a lot of ways that folks locally and remotely can be volunteering for the campaign. We're going to need a lot of people power. As you can see, I'm not particularly, I don't imagine that the Democrat or Republican establishment folks are going to be particularly enthused. And so we really have to get people power put to work in order to win. And I think that, we can do that together. And I think we have a real chance to show that a district like this, that, to show what's possible in a purple swing district like this in these midterms, and flip a critical seat for keeping the House in these midterm elections, which I'm sure I don't have to emphasize how important that's going to be.
Yeah, 100%. Well, best of luck to you, Brittany. I can feel the energy and the fire, and you're ready to shake things up. And I think that's awesome. I think we need new faces, new perspectives, and people to kind of challenge common assumptions within both parties. So it's great to meet you. I hope people listening to this will learn more about you. And with that, we'll say goodbye, nerds.
Goodbye, nerds. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, Brittany. Take care.